Okay, whilst that's loading up, great honour to be here today, surrounded by so many great people and great minds. It's a real privilege to be invited here to speak about what I'm going to speak about. I'm a team physician, I'm a doctor, I'm a generalist, I'm a family doctor, a general practitioner. I'm also a specialist in sport and exercise medicine. And amongst the jobs that I do, I'm the club doctor at West Ham Football Club. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story and illustrate a story that feeds on beautifully from the last presentation, because it's all to do with the ethical concepts of health and anti-doping. I wrote the abstract that we submitted for this with a very brave young gentleman called Dylan Tombides, who I must not refer to as a patient, otherwise he'd get very cross with me. I did it once, I made the mistake once, and he told me off and he said, "No, I'm an athlete, I'm a footballer." Dylan is one of my footballers at West Ham Football Club, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about his story, which illustrates some of the impacts of health. I understand, and Dylan understands, that a lot of what's been discussed at this meeting and everything that WADA does is for the masses. But every now and again, you get an exception to the rule, someone at the extremes that really truly tests systems and procedures. And I think that you learn a lot more, perhaps, from examining some of those things about how you can adapt your procedures for the future. So hopefully I'm going to come up with a few suggestions that you might be able to consider over the next day. The aim of my talk is, I guess I'm really asking you to consider two things. One is it would have been wonderful, when the story that I tell you, it would have been wonderful if I'd have had a medical expert at the World Anti-Doping Authority that I could have turned to communicate with, to get specialist anti-doping medical advice, and that will become clear why. And I also think it would have made life very easy, much easier for the patient and perhaps myself, if there were databases and follow-up of athletes that have cancer diagnosed through anti-doping testing. And I'll try and illustrate that. So I'm going to very broadly, towards the end of my talk, consider ethics under the four main pillars. I'm going to touch on autonomy of the patient, beneficence, so everything that we do must benefit our patients and athletes. We shouldn't do harm, and there has to be a component of justice. So it's very apt that I'm following so many eminent lawyers that are far greater experts than I am on this topic. Put another way, in the words of Henry Ford, who pioneered the car industry, he said, if I'd have asked customers what they would have wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And by that, what do I mean? I was very, very fortunate recently to be part of a consensus paper with the International Olympic Committee. And one of the things that I learned about there was something called human-centered design, which is a very new strand of research that says, that basically observes what people go through and what our patients go through and what our athletes go through, and to observe what happens to them and the path that they take and try and improve and adapt and improve the processes and improve what we do around that. So I'm going to tell you the story of Dylan Tombides. I have his consent to discuss what I'm going to discuss with you today. He obviously wrote and consented to the abstract that we submitted. And much of what I'm going to tell you is already in the public domain. In June 2011, Dylan was playing for Australia in the Under-17 World Cup in Mexico that we've heard about before. He had just lost 4-0 to Uzbekistan when he was taken in for his random anti-doping testing. Shortly after, he failed the drugs test because he had a very high level of beta-HCG, which was forwarded up to Professor Dvorak, who contacted his team physician with Australia, with the Australian team in Mexico, and he was rushed off to see the urology specialists. So he had double bad news. One, he failed a drugs test, and two, he had a diagnosis of testicular cancer to deal with. Over the last 2.5 years that I've been working with him, he has had an enormous battle and fight with his disease. In the initial phase, he had the initial diagnosis in the beta HCG, and it was dealt with, I have to say, in an exemplary manner, and he was very, very quick, and I certainly I don't believe that he would fault anything that was done in the initial stages. Since then, he's had a lot of chemotherapy. He's been admitted to hospital again today for chemotherapy. And one of the problems that I encountered with chemotherapy and his treatment in hospital is that they don't actually know what the solvents are that the chemotherapeutic agents are dissolved in. And we looked into it and we couldn't find out at all. No one would tell us. We don't know the processes with which the solvents are made, where they come from, and we couldn't put in a therapeutic use exemption. When he had his diagnosis of testicular cancer, all he wanted to do was play football and golf, but predominantly football. And that was the essence of everything that I was trying to do for him, was keep him available for selection. He was given dexamethasone and other steroids, and he had growth factors following chemotherapy to try and boost his neutrophils and other blood cells. He also had stem cell transplantation. But I couldn't fill in a therapeutic use exemption because I didn't know what he was being given, and the people that were giving him what he was being given didn't know exactly what he was being given, which I found quite shocking, but that's the way it is. And I was told by our authorities that he would have to step out of and not be available and step out of football for about 6 months. The other option was that he could remain in anti-doping and wait for a failed test, and then we would have the fun and stress of appealing that, with him not really knowing what was going on all the time. He's had a rocky path, undoubtedly, and that's a picture on the top left of Dylan and his family. He had his last year whilst on chemotherapy. There's a photo on the top right of him getting his first team debut, and as you can see from that, he was on high-dose chemotherapy at the time. He's broken a lot of rules. He's had a lot of surgery. He's come back quicker and fitter than any of his specialists and oncologists could have ever imagined. On the bottom left is a photo of him looking very fit and healthy this season, available for selection. When FIFA coined the terms football for hope and football for health, they really hit home here. For Dylan to have taken away, we both believe, to have taken away his ability, or at any time to take away his ability to play football and to compete and be available for selection, would have been absolutely devastating for him and his family. Devastating. So it really is so poignant and so important. But my big question is performance enhancement possible when treatments and disease are so obviously inherently performance harming? One of the problems that we had, to take Manny Pacquiao, the boxer, when asked about what he was doing and why he beat people up so badly in the boxing ring, he said, "It's nothing personal, I'm just doing my job." Unfortunately, we found a similar response with some of the people that were administrating, for understandable reasons, they were administrating the rules and laws that come down from WADA, and they were unable to help us, and they were unable to guide me. So of our experiences, suggesting to stop playing football for 6 months was devastating to the player and his family when I had to report that back. I had to fight very hard to keep some of this out of the media because it wasn't appropriate for it to be played out there. And I was unable to discuss unusual medical circumstances with anti-doping medical experts, which would have been very, very helpful and appropriate, I think. And in extreme medical circumstances, I don't think it's possible to argue that you're setting a precedent, because I don't believe that that can be challenged on ethical, sporting, medical, or probably moral grounds either. Another challenge that I had and encountered with Dylan was that he wanted to use some alternative treatments, alternative therapies, such as various different types of supplementation. And the irony is that his chemotherapy probably has less evidence base than many of the supplements that he wanted to take, albeit that we've learned earlier today, and everybody's aware, of the risks of contamination with taking supplements. And I had very difficult conversations to have with him and his family about that I think equally could be avoided, because in his circumstances, if he chose to take supplements, whether they had substances or not, I don't believe too many medical experts would have actually been able to say that they were particularly performance enhancing for him when taken into context with everything else that was going on with his metastatic disease and with the chemotherapy and the surgery and the radiotherapy that he has been receiving. And that caused, I would argue, undue psychological stress to him and his family, and making very, very difficult decisions for him to make when all he wants to do is just be available for football, even if he might not be fit to play football, which are two different concepts. I also think it would have helped both Dylan and myself if there had been follow-up or a group, a database held of other similar patients, obviously with their consent, but when medical tests are being done by a doctor, that doctor has a duty of care to their patient. And I just wonder, I don't know the answers, I'm sure you might touch on it in the next day or so, I just wonder whether or not there are ethical considerations there about WADA having a duty of care to athletes that fail tests for these reasons. And I think it would have been very helpful for peer support, for me to have peer support as well, and for more importantly for Dylan to have peer support and to know what's happened and what best practice is and to be able to learn from what's happened. And again, that was touched on by other speakers, but I also wonder about whether or not there should be follow-up and databases held of people that are borderline for failing these tests, and what processes and procedures there are for following them up. So to conclude, I summarised some of these considerations under the different pillars of medical ethics. I do believe that patients have insufficient autonomy when rigid application of anti-doping rules are being followed in extreme medical circumstances, and where continued participation in the sport is desired and I would argue essential. Prompt communication channels with medical professionals in these circumstances would protect patient autonomy, and it prevents stress and unnecessary decisions being made with medical personnel who aren't necessarily experts in this field. So it would help greatly to be able to speak to someone that really knows what they're talking about. And I think when medical staff and athletes aren't aware of consumed therapeutic agents as part of their medical care, it's probably reasonable concessions might need to be made, and very promptly by medical anti-doping experts, rather than belatedly if in the process of having retrospective TUEs and appeals. Evidence is lacking for many conventional treatments that Dylan has received, and also for alternative treatments. So it can be very, very difficult to assess the relative physical and psychological benefits. But having said that, I think if in these circumstances, if you were to wish to take supplements, maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing. I'm going to whiz through. You've got these in your abstract handouts, I think, as I've mentioned them before. This is Dylan a few weeks ago. He's currently had a little bit of a setback, and he's in hospital today, starting another high-dose chemotherapy, and he will be available on Monday. And I don't know what drugs they're giving him, and I can't fill in a therapeutic use exemption. So I only had two considerations that I thought were very important to share with you today, and just to reiterate in summary, I hope that you will consider whether or not you can have a fast track for patients in extreme medical circumstances, where they can actually speak, the team physician can speak directly to a medical expert at WADA. If this is possible, it would be very important to disseminate that through every national anti-doping organisation. And I do believe that there is a really important role for having a database and follow-up of patients, of athletes with cancer that have failed anti-doping for medical reasons. And I thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you.